Hi, I'm Jim Schwartz, Director of Research Agronomy and PFR here at Beck's Hybrids. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about adapting to nitrogen markets. How do we invest and enhance that nitrogen dollar that we spend every year? You know, we are in different times. The markets have gone up, but also input costs have gone up. But you know, I get a lot of questions about how do I manage that investment as it relates to my nitrogen costs? And I would tell you, in order to get something different, you must do something different. So we're going to talk about some things today to enhance that nitrogen investment that may require you to think differently about what you do on your farm. Speaking of different, we're also living in a different world as it relates to the weather around us. Ask any farmer and he'll tell you, yeah, I see a lot more heavy rainfall events, more 2, 3, 4 inch rainfalls. That impacts what we do with our nitrogen. This data would tell you we see a clear trend in more heavy rainfall events. But not only is the weather changing, so are the hybrids that you're planting on your farm. So we've got two different studies here. The top one is from Purdue, the lower one is from the University of Illinois. And what they did was they measured old hybrids compared to new modern hybrids and how they take up nitrogen. If you look in that red box, you can see that modern hybrids are taking up more nitrogen later in the growing season. So we have a couple confounding factors. First of all, we have more nitrogen later in the season taken up, and we have more rainfall that leads to higher losses typically most years. The other thing that's a little bit different is as we keep these plants alive and green throughout the growing season, they are taking up more nitrogen later in the year. This is some data that I found that talks about, it's called the senescence index. And what it explains is that as we keep those plants green longer, they're taking up more nitrogen and increasing yield throughout that growing season, especially later in the year. Well, what are we doing to keep those hybrids greener and alive longer? Fungicides. We're spraying fungicides at a much higher rate than we ever have before. So think about it. More rainfall, more loss of nitrogen. We're keeping these hybrids alive longer and they're taking up more nitrogen later in the year. So we have to adapt and have to adjust even in the reality that we're dealing with today as it relates to higher nitrogen prices. So let's start with the basics first. How much nitrogen does a corn plant take up? When we measure the content of the stalks and the grain, we know that the content that it is in that bushel of grain and the stalk, it takes around 1 to 1.1 pounds of nitrogen to produce that bushel of corn. Now, so I've been in this business about 38 years. I remember when we started, it's like, if that was a number, right? If I said I wanted to grow 250 bushel corn, I'm going to apply 250 to 270 pounds of nitrogen because nitrogen was cheap, right? It was not a limiting factor as far as costs and inputs. And we didn't have the concerns that we have today around the environmental impact of some of the inputs that we're putting on our farm. So it was easy. We just said, hey, I want to grow 250 bushel corn. I'm going to put on 250 to 275 pounds of nitrogen. Now I'm going to shock you a little bit and share this statement with you. Applied nitrogen has very little correlation to final yield. Now that's probably a little bit surprising, but I want to share some data with you to help maybe bring that to light a little bit more. But really, if you think about it, what nitrogen you put on in a field in any one given year may or may not have a lot of correlation to the yield. In fact, if you think about it, about 50 to 60% of the nitrogen that you put on every year, I hate to tell you this, doesn't get into the corn plant. So applied nitrogen really doesn't have a lot to do with the final yield. If you look at historical data, this is a graph from the University of Illinois. Those orange triangles, that's yield. Those blue dots, that's nitrogen usage. So we've almost doubled our corn yields, but look at what's happened to the nitrogen usage rates over the last 30, 40 years. They've stabilized, they've leveled off. So you can see there's really not a correlation here as it relates to yield and nitrogen usage. Here's some data from the University of Illinois. What they did is they went to hundreds of fields and they looked at what was the yield versus the nitrogen applied. I want to share something with you on this chart that I think is really, really interesting. If you kind of cut this into quarters, here's yields nitrogen rates 200 and less, nitrogen rates 150 and less, and here's yields 200 bushel or more. There are a whole lot of dots, and you can keep moving to the left and see there's a lot of high yield with low nitrogen rates. Well, how can that be? How can we have very high yield with low nitrogen rates? And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can manage nitrogen by managing rates, placement, timing, and source. Okay, those four things. Loss has a lot to do with your soil type, how you apply it, but I want to focus on those first four things. So first, let's talk about nitrogen rates. So we've done a lot of studies in practical farm research, and if you look over time, we've developed our economic optimum nitrogen rates where we share, basically that gray line is corn after beans, the green line is corn after corn. And you can look based on the nitrogen price, the economic optimum nitrogen rate varies. In fact, what I want you to think about though, is as we develop this dot, right? That means there's a lot of dots up here and a lot of dots down here. And this is the average. Well, what does that mean? How do we understand that a little bit better? Well, we've done a lot of work. Here's our data from this year. This is 2021 multi-location nitrogen rate study, starting with the 2x2x2 system. Now on your left is a 2x2, and then all the other rates are 2x2x2. Here's the interesting thing. When you look at the most economically optimum nitrogen rate this year, it's 160 pounds of nitrogen. But look at the yields, 253 bushel corn with 160 pounds of nitrogen. Now the other thing I want you to note is when you look at the higher nitrogen rates, we do increase yield, but we don't increase our yields economically. So the economic optimum nitrogen rate this year was 160 across all our locations. Now the question a lot of you may ask us is, well, how do you know if you had enough or you didn't have enough? So one of the things we do is we do stalk nitrate tests. So when we reach black layer, we go and we cut those stalks and down at the lower part of the plant and we measure the nitrates. Now, this is not exact science, but a lot of folks will say somewhere when you look in that 700 to 2,000 parts per million range, that's kind of the sweet spot for where we want to be at the end of the year. So if you're below that 700 range, and again, this varies from university and state, but when you look at that, we want to be kind of in that 700 as a minimum, maximum 2,000. So look at the data that we shared there. What you can find where we were at that 160 pound rate, we were pretty good in that sweet spot. But when we upped our nitrogen rates, we were way over what we think would be the maximum amount needed. Well, how can that be? First of all, you're looking at that data going, yeah, 190 pounds of applied nitrogen, you're going 250 plus bushel corn. How can you have nitrogen left over? That has a lot to do with the source, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to show you this data. I thought this was really interesting. This is only one location data. This is from our southern Illinois location, lower organic matter soils. It's this loam clay soil. But the interesting thing there, and frankly, I would say the shocking thing there to me was we grew 255 bushel corn with 130 units of nitrogen. Now here's the thing I want you to understand. This is not normal. Every year is different. There's all kinds of environmental factors that will impact the amount of nitrogen that's needed to grow corn. So I always tell people that if you want me to tell you exactly how much nitrogen you should use, when you should use it, how you should apply it, whether or not you should stabilize it, I can answer that question for you in September, right? Because then I have all the information I need. So it isn't going to work like this every year. This year was a little bit different. Well, what's the impact? One other thing that we talked about last year was looking at, as I change my planting populations, as I increase my planting populations, do I need to increase my nitrogen rate? Same thing. The answer is no. We don't need to increase our nitrogen rate as we increase our populations. And you're probably just scratching your head going, that just doesn't make sense. It's not intuitive. Well, where is that nitrogen coming from? That's what people are understanding and starting to take into account more. It's the soil. You know, when I started, I said applied nitrogen has very little correlation to final yield because it's that fourth bullet I talked about earlier, the source. There are multiple sources of nitrogen, and one of the best sources of nitrogen for your farm is your soil. Here's some data from 2016 from University of Illinois. What they did was they had some trials where they did unfertilized and different fertilizer rates. Interestingly enough, they had an unfertilized check in June, and they measured 167 pounds of nitrogen in that unfertilized check. Now, I want to be clear, this is at a 2-foot depth, and this is a dark, deep prairie soil, probably 4.5+% organic matter soil. But that's an example of the nitrogen supplying power of your soils. 2016, again, different locations. This is where they put different rates on in the fall. So you can see they did 175 and 200 pound fall application, and they came back, this is in April. And we haven't really mineralized a lot of nitrogen in April, but when you look at the data, look for instance at Warren County, 200 pounds of nitrogen applied in the fall, and they found 300 pounds of nitrogen in the soil in April, when we haven't mineralized a lot. So your soil absolutely is a source of nitrogen to feed your crop. Share some data. This was just released in October of this past year from Purdue University. Here was a quote that I pulled out of it, and I think it's something that we all need to think about when we think about nitrogen needs. Some soils provide as little as 25% of the crop requirement, with the remainder coming from fertilizer in. Other soils provide in excess of 50% of the crop nitrogen demand, and that's from mineralization of that organic matter. Go last year when we talked and did our deep dive on nitrogen. Go watch that video if you'd like, because I spent about 25 minutes talking about mineralization. It helps explain this process and explain where the nitrogen comes from. So nitrogen efficiency on your farm really depends on a number of factors. We can manage some of it, the rate, the source, the placement, the timing. I'm going to talk about some studies here in a minute where we do that. We can also manage loss, especially when it talks about leaching and denitrification. We can manage that, and organic mineralization. But if you look at those bottom two things, really what are we talking about? We're talking about the soil. The soil is a major factor, right, in determining your final yields and actually determining the final nitrogen rate that you'll need. Here's some data from the University of Illinois. It's a long time. This is actually from a textbook that my son is using right now in one of his classes. I thought it was really interesting. What it talks about is the different nitrogen rate requirements based on soil type. And it makes sense, right? On the right side is a sandier soil. You have higher requirements than on a loam soil. Well, why would that be? It's the nitrogen supplying capacity of those soils. Here's some other data from a field over different years. And it talked about predicting fertilizer needs, and basically one of the quotes in the textbook was, look, fertilizer needs are not really related to yield level, but rather are soil specific. And again, the thing I want to point out is soil specific year to year to year. That's what this chart's telling you. Every year can be a little bit different depending on how much nitrogen we can mineralize. Now there's another source that oftentimes we just take as a bonus if we can. So if you're in a corn-soybean rotation, we understand that the soybean residue has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as it breaks down, it actually supplies nitrogen to my crop. In fact, if you're on a loamier soil or a higher productivity soil, a conservative estimate would be 45 pounds. And if you're on a more sandy or coarse textured soil, maybe it's 25 pounds. In the past, I think most growers have said, I'm just going to take that as a bonus. But as we look at high nitrogen prices and what we're dealing with today, it might be a good idea to start saying in a corn bean rotation, I'm going to take that credit and use that towards my applied fertilizer rates and needs. Well, what about placement? We just talked about rates and sources. What about placement? Can we impact the efficiency of our nitrogen use via placement? Well, it's PFR proven. We've got 4 years of data where we took nitrogen, and in the past we've applied it on one side of the row. Now we are applying it to both sides of the row. And we showed a 6 bushel jump simply by taking that 30 units and applying it to both sides of the row. So placement matters. Then when we bumped it up to 60 units, we saw a little bit of an increase, not a huge one, but what it tells us in that data is the most important part of that was placement on both sides of the row. It had a lot to do with preferential root growth and getting those roots to grow, because roots do grow in the presence of nitrogen. Now, one of the questions we got from growers is some of those systems they're not inexpensive. Now, we believe they definitely do pay off, but what about if I just take my nitrogen and lay it on top of the ground? It's a less expensive system. Can that work? Can I be more efficient? So we wanted to test that out. This is the first year we've done dribbling on top of the row. One of the things we're concerned about as it relates to 28% on top of the row is volatilization. If you look at UAN solutions, or 25% ammonia, 25% nitrate, and then 50% urea. So what happens to that urea molecule when we lay it on the surface of the soil? So you see the molecule over on the left, it combines with water, and then there's an enzyme called urease that converts that basically to ammonia gas. So if that nitrogen is still laying on the surface of the soil, it will volatilize off as a gas. So what we need to do is get that urea down into the soil so that when that ammonia gas gets in the soil, combines with hydrogen from water and becomes ammonium and is held by that soil. That's what we're shooting to do. So what did our data tell us this year? This is the first year we've done it, and basically when you look at the data comparing the two systems, so conceal, knifing that into the ground versus dribble, it was really only 2 bushel off, but you look at today's prices, that's $10. All right, so that's not insignificant. But the other thing I want you to look at is that bar on the right. So on the right, we used a urease inhibitor. In other words, it controls that urease enzyme and slows down the loss of the nitrogen to that gas in the air. And what we found was there really wasn't a lot of difference. So what that bar on the right tells us is we didn't experience a lot of volatilization of nitrogen this year. And in fact, most of our locations received a nice rainfall to move that 28 into the soil, so we didn't experience losses. What I'm trying to explain through all that is that this 2 bushel loss in other years, if it's hot and dry, or we have high pH soils at the surface or heavy residue at the surface after we apply, we think the losses could be higher and the data that spread in the yield might be bigger, but that's why we're going to keep testing this. But placement does matter. One of the things we wanted to do then is see if we could measure where that nitrogen actually exists in the soil via these different placement regimes. So what we did, you can see those little corn rows there, and then we went and sampled in the row and then every 3 inches across the row because we wanted to see where that nitrogen exists. You've probably seen this data. So on this graph, where the corn plants are, that's right where the rows were. And then we went and said, how much, when we knife that nitrogen right down the middle of the row, how much of it's in the middle of the row? This was anhydrous. And you can see 4 weeks after, most of it's in the ammonium form. That's a green line. That's what we'd expect. It's still in that ammonium form. Some of it is converting to nitrates, but it's right in the middle of the row. Keep in mind that about 70+% of a corn's roots are within 7 inches of that row. Okay. Now, we went back and looked at 8 weeks. Sure enough, we flipped, so now more of it's in the nitrate form, which makes sense, than is in the ammonium form, but it's still in the middle of the row, and keep in mind where those corn roots are. So then our folks at Ohio, they wanted to study that a little bit more this year with our 2x2x2 application systems. So here's 190 pounds of anhydrous pre-plant. You can see it's in the middle of the row, no surprise. What about when we applied it at V3? So now the V3 application is a green line, right in the middle of the row. Then we tried again, we split a little bit, 30 units pre, and then the rest of it in the middle of the row, that's where the nitrogen is. But here's the interesting graph. When we split it and did 2x2x2, look at what we found. Where's the nitrogen at? It's right by the row, right where that corn plant has its roots. And so we think that placement does matter. So as you think about, can I be more efficient via placement? We think the answer is yes. And I think one of the studies we need to start doing is cutting our rates and using placement to be more efficient. I think that's something we'll consider in the future. How about anhydrous? A lot of growers in the West use anhydrous, and I know a lot of growers this year because A, they were able to get their anhydrous, and it was more affordable in the fall. They went ahead and grabbed their anhydrous and put it all on in the fall. And in many years, there's nothing wrong with that. So we wanted to look at and see if could we be more efficient by applying nitrogen under the row. As guys are moving to strip till systems, more banding of fertility, one of the questions we get is, what if I band my nitrogen directly under the row? Can I cut my rates and be more effective that way? So we studied 2 different rates, 150 and 190 pounds, underneath the row versus between the rows, or most of you apply at an angle. What's the difference? And what we found, we thought, could we be more efficient by applying under the row? What we found, we didn't really see the big differences. For the most part, it didn't really matter. Now, I would contend, I think a lot of this has to do with our rates. Go back to what I showed you with the Illinois location where 130 pounds was all we needed. I'm not sure, if you look at the rate titrations we use, I'm not sure we use low enough rates. And that'll come back up in a minute when I talk about another study we did. But this year what we found, we didn't really gain a lot of efficiency going underneath the row. Now the other thing I want to talk about as it relates to timing and placement is depth of anhydrous application. So when we apply anhydrous in the soil, it's a gas, and it has a very high affinity for water. So as you inject that gas, that band will expand until it reaches enough water, and that anhydrous will grab a hydrogen from water, and when that happens, that band will stop expanding. So if you have decent soil moisture and a more medium textured soil, that band won't be quite as big than if it's very, very dry and it's coarse texture, that band will expand. But when that band expands, that can impact those young seedlings and roots that are trying to grow. So one of the things we want to test is, does depth of placement matter? And you all know it does, but here's what our data found, and it was really clear to us. So on your left, we did 8-inch depth of application. On your right, 4-inch depth of application. We did it 7 or more days, so we applied it and waited a week to plant, and then we did it within that first week, we went ahead and planted. And if you look at this data, it's really clear. A couple things are really clear. Number one, depth is the most important factor. So if you got a plant within a week, look at the difference between within 6 days on both of those graphs. It's big, but the most important thing is the depth. Look at the difference within a week at 4-inch depth versus basically the 8-inch depth. So depth of application is critical. So if you can't wait a week, make sure you get it 8 inches deep, 7, 8 inches, something like that deep, because you will injure seedlings. Here's what we found. When you look across the top of that picture, that's the 4-inch depth. So on your left is within 6 days, on your right is waiting a week or more. It gets better, right? And that makes sense. On the bottom is that 8-inch depth, and you can see there's a little bit of stunning within 6 days. Ideally, and I realize we don't deal with ideal conditions all the time, but if you can wait a week or more, that's the best. But again, bottom line, as it relates to placement of anhydrous in the spring, depth is the most important part. How about spring versus fall? We get this question a lot, and we started doing these studies this past year. This year, the data told us didn't really matter. Well, think about what happened this year. We had very, very high mineralization. We didn't have high losses at our western locations. They're well-drained soils, so it didn't really matter. And we didn't have conditions this year that led to a lot of denitrification. However, I would tell you, so this is a study we've done over many, many years. This is one of our 5 success strategies on corn, and we would tell you that all 4 of these bars are different ways you can split apply nitrogen. So these bars are compared to 100% pre-plant incorporated. And our data would say it's very, very clear. One way to be more efficient with your nitrogen is split apply. Because the thing about split applications is you gain information as the year goes on, and you can know, hey, maybe I've had a lot of denitrification, I need to add more. Maybe I've had great mineralization like we've had the last couple years, and I can reduce my rate a little bit. But split application pays. That is a timing success strategy. Now, the last topic I want to talk about is microbial nitrogen products. One of the things that we get a lot of questions about now, especially as nitrogen rates have gone up, is can I use these products to be more efficient? Can I cut my nitrogen rate? So we've tested 3 different products. Now, SOURCE and Envita we've tested for 2 years. Pivot Bio we tested in 2020. We did not get, they had a new product called Pivot Bio 40. We could not get that product to test this year. We hope to test it in the future. But I want to share with you some information about it and then some data. So SOURCE is pretty much, I'll call it a chemistry, so that it gets passed through the plant, goes into the soil, and helps release the nutrients in your soil by activating microbes. Envita is a little different. Envita, what they would suggest they do is they make every cell a little nitrogen factory in that plant. That's how Envita works. Pivot Bio Proven, or the new Pivot Bio Proven 40, is basically, it's a biological that itself in the soil releases nitrogen from the organic matter. Now, one thing to consider about that product is when it releases that that nitrogen into the organic matter, it's actually part of that soil construct. So there's a lot of competing activity down there, and that may impact some of the results we've seen. But here's the data. When you look, what we wanted to test is on the left, we wanted to test using the product at 190 pounds, and on the right, 165. Could we cut our rates, use these products, and improve our efficiency? So a couple things to look at. So with SOURCE, what we found is that it didn't really matter. We didn't see a response. We also didn't see big yield differences between the 165 and the 190. So what's that tell you? Nitrogen wasn't a limiting factor. I personally believe that as we do more of the testing with these biologicals, we need to cut our rates even more, because 165 pounds, a lot of years, is plenty of nitrogen on our higher organic matter soils. How about Envita? Same thing, really. The differences were small. There were differences, and we tend to see the differences at those lower nitrogen rates, but the cost of the product, it's right there. It really wasn't quite paying off. They did see differences. Again, I think we need to use a lower rate in the future. Pivot Bio Proven, basically when you look at it, it's almost the exact same data. So we're close, we're really fine tuning, I think. I think there's some potential in these different products. We just need to learn how to use them. What rate might work, maybe different rate, I don't know, but we're gonna continue to test these to see if we can fine tune that just a little bit. So as we wrap this up, how do we maximize our nitrogen investment in a year when the prices of the product have gone through the roof? Number one, to me, this is one of the most important. Account for all the potential sources. Remember, your soil is a nitrogen factory. Don't discount the soybean credit. Take those things into consideration. Yes, the corn plant needs a pound or so to produce a bushel of corn, but that doesn't mean you have to apply a pound to the soil. Maximize other tools such as timing, placement, and stabilizers. If you change the timing, if you manage your placement, if you stabilize, you can probably do some things to be more efficient with that nitrogen investment. Provide the correct forms at the right times in the needed supply. For the most part, the nitrate molecule is the one that's mobile in the soil, so positionally available to the corn plant. Understand that nitrogen uptake curve and make sure that when that corn plant needs a lot of nitrogen, you're providing that nitrate source to get to the plant. Lastly, measure and understand your results throughout the year. Look, this isn't going to be the last time that fertility prices spike. It's a great opportunity to do some testing. When I started, I said, in order to get something different, you need to do something different. This is a great year to try some different things to see how efficient you can be utilizing other sources, different placement, different timing, different rates, stabilizers. Do that. One final thought I want to leave with you. My dad told me this when I was a young kid. He said, you can't save your way to prosperity. So cutting your nitrogen rate, cutting your fertilizer rate could absolutely be the right decision. But doing it without understanding all the other mitigating factors and making sure that you're doing things to maximize and enhance the efficiency may not be the right idea from you. I have no idea. This year, we may have rains every week and it may take 1.5 pounds of nitrogen to create a bushel of corn. I don't know. But by utilizing some of the tools we've talked about, I do believe we can be more efficient with our nitrogen dollars each and every year into the future. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great day.